Oh, hi there. We're glad you're watching one of our virtual lunch presentations. We have a lot of good information that we've been accumulating over the past several years, and we invite you to look down just below here and hit the subscribe button, and the little bell will give you a reminder of when our next presentation is published here on the YouTube channel. Thanks for your support. Appreciate it. Our friends at Nautel are our benefactors today. And here's a little thing from them.
One of the other things that we wanted to talk about was site hardening, and this is just something I grabbed out of a YouTube video. Somebody throwing a freezing rain shield over their heat pump at their house, but it's really not something that, especially in cold weather country, that you laugh at too hard, because having ice come off a tower and punch through the roof of a building can make a heck of a mess.
But yeah, obviously, with storm season coming up, this is an important thing for floods. For good grief, look at what happened in Yellowstone Park, or in terms of other places. You could lose a ground system, you could lose the guy anchors. There are all sorts of things that we want to watch out for and harden our sites. But to get to our program for today, we're real happy to have Joe Fleming with us. Joe is from the Virginia Public Media Group, and Joe is going to talk to us, or lead to us, and answer questions, and we'll interchange things here on remote control hacks. And Joe, let's turn it over to you and see where we go.
Sure. So I actually was initially thinking a little bit about doing some history, and I see some people like Harry Hallicanen on and everybody with some history in that regard. But I decided to take a little bit of a different approach, and I'm basically going to concentrate on current stuff with Burke. I'm going to probably make a few assumptions that you know a little bit about a Burke system, but I'm going to really dig into some of the groundwork as far as some of the custom stuff that we can really do. Autopilot really is where it's all about, and you should be seeing my autopilot now. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So this is actually the live autopilot that I run at home for the 5 stations that we have. And so you'll see anything just like I see it right now, including if there's anything going on at any of our sites, good, bad, or indifferent. The basic system we have has 3 different, we have a total of 5 FMs. 3 of them have ARC plus touch units. The other 2 have ARC solos. And then we've done a lot with SNMP to expand way beyond that. One of the first things that I want to show you is I'll get a lot into custom screens, but to really make it cool is when you've got 5 sites, 2 engineers, and miscellaneous other combinations, you're running numerous computers, and it's so great to be able to actually have customization that just when you log in automatically falls into line. So if you go into tools and options, down here 2/3 of the way down on the options setting is a place to change your default custom view folder. And we use a Google Drive location so that ultimately you can see I've got about a dozen different custom views, and some of them are pretty simple. They show some transmitter output, HVAC, things like that. And I'll show you some of the more complicated ones in a little bit as well. I also want to talk about virtual channels. Virtuals are a really cool thing that can be either on the ARC Plus touch units or on the autopilot software. And I mean, a lot of times they can be as simple as just simple math, like we're going to see on this one, just showing a calculated value for my site WCNV. Licensed TPO is 1.45 kilowatts. And the value ends up coming out in kilowatts. So I just do a simple multiplier to get a percentage on it. And I'm running 95% power on that station right now. They can get a lot more complicated. As you can see, if you look on any one of them, the options, you get to choose your site. You can choose also from your list of your SNMP devices. You can choose math and logic functions. So it really comes down to being very careful with the syntax, but whatever you can come up with. If you want to come up with something, I've got one that converts a Celsius temperature to Fahrenheit. And that's just the old 9/5 plus 32 or whatever it is format. But whatever you can come up with, you can have those virtuals on there. But the big things that we really want to talk about, you probably have done a little bit with those. So those are pretty basic stuff that a lot of people tend to ignore, but they're convenient for you. The really detailed things that we want to get into, though, are especially the macros and the custom views. I actually run one macro on a regular basis that, I almost forgot, I actually have to use Jet software for them. It's a wonderful option that you definitely want to have if you're purchasing a Burke system. You want to get the Jet option. If you don't, you have to write everything by text, and a simple one like what I'm going to open up here from one of my stations just checks if I'm in maintenance mode or not on a regular basis. It makes it into a graphic combination, but it's a simple if then and send some information accordingly. So I run this on all my stations on a regular basis, and if I'm not in maintenance mode, then it just ends the macro, and that's it. And it runs like every couple hours. So if you go to a site, put it into maintenance mode and forget to do it and take it out of maintenance. We know we've all done that at one point or another. This will email you, and when the condition is true that you're in maintenance mode, it just sends you an email, and you turn around the car and go take care of it and put it back in. But I also run some that are much more complicated than that. For instance, switching transmitters. I run them all directly on my Arc Plus units. So if I want to do something like if I get a power bump and whatever, then we get something like that. It looks a lot more complicated, but it's basically breaking it down into lots of if-then combinations. Condensed version of it, and I'll grab a screen capture and send these to Barry so they can give ideas for anybody. If you pour your way through, this macro runs whenever it gets triggered by various conditions, which I've got written in the comments right here. Meter channel positions, or sometimes statuses as well. And usually, like if you get a power bump and the transmitter turns off, does it turn right back on by itself? Does it not turn back on? Is there a delay? Anything like that. So it does a series of if-thens of, well, which one is selected to the antenna. And some of our sites don't have generators. So one of the things I also check is, what is the power level? I'm only metering one of the three phases, but if it's below about 75 volts, it says, yeah, it's probably not going to turn on. And so the emails, which become notifications out of the various blue boxes, like that one, this one here, once it executes this macro, it'll say exactly what happened. You get the email. So you might not be listening. You'll never know you were off the air because you're only off for 2 seconds. It runs through, it executes the macro, turns it right back on, and you get an email that says, yeah, we were off and we're back. So it keeps the downtime very highly reduced. It's extremely convenient, especially if you have a site where there's any kind of volatile electricity or any other variation. And then you just have to look at the email and say, okay, we're back to normal. The one thing about these, and you learn some of these the hard way after getting hosed in one form or another. If you want to do any kind of work and you have a tower crew up there, for instance, and you want to turn the transmitter off because they're getting close to the antenna. Well, if you turn the transmitter off, the macro is going to run and say, hey, what's going on? So you got to make sure you always remember that. And so one of the things that I've done is I've included at the beginning, a test is a day of the week. It becomes a quick, easy way if you know you don't have to be on site and the tower crew is going to be there and significantly lower than your height, for instance. You can change it so that on that particular day, it either does ignore it altogether or whatever, and basically all ends up at the end statement here on the lower right. They actually let you build several end statements, but I tend to like to do mine where it keeps it just as one. I've actually got a screen capture of this as a visual where I've got it color coded to the various sections. So as you're tracing your way through, you can really say, oh, what's going on? But once you get it all built, it literally can be a set it and forget it kind of thing. I also have a variation that I use on a regular basis. This one actually runs approximately every 10 to 15 minutes. And in fact, I'll check that in a second here. What it is I basically mute channels that are not being used, like my auxiliary transmitter. Well, it's great if I get an alarm if the auxiliary is off the air, but if I'm operating on my main, I don't really need that alarm. So what I do is I go through and I verify approximately every 10, 15 minutes with this particular macro, and I've got them duplicated onto each of the stations. Again, it starts with just a simple, runs every 17 minutes. And it just says, well, which transmitter switched to the antenna. And then accordingly, based on that, I can mute metering or status indications, and they show up on the autopilot system as grayed out. So you can still see what's going on, but they're muted and they don't create any alarms. It's a real convenient way to make it so that you don't really have any false alarms on things when you don't need to. Again, in this case, it literally is just the 3 basically if-then statements. So if the transmitter site is chosen to the main or the auxiliary antenna, and then if the transmitter is at a very low power, or on the other transmitter if it's at a very low power. So like if you turn it on, you go out and you want to do a weekly inspection, take a bunch of readings and everything, it'll unmute if it happens to hit that 17-minute cycle while you're doing everything. And then the next time around, you turn the transmitter off because of the fact that it's still going by the antenna switch. You've never switched it. You just did some maintenance and you're into the dummy load and everything. It shuts off and says, okay, back to mute mode, and it doesn't have to worry about any alarms. Keeps a lot of the extra details very precise. I've got a request. Can I make the screen larger? I'm already running full screen, so I'm not sure. Maybe Barry knows if there was a way to make that happen otherwise.
Basically, you can make it larger yourself by somewhere here on Zoom. You can go full screen, or YouTube.
If you go up in the upper right-hand corner, Barry, if you've got view up there, you can pick standard, and that will give it the widest possible, or they're side by side with speaker or gallery.
Thank you. That's absolutely right.
There you go. Okay. So this is one of the more intense macros that I run. Are there any questions on it? It's sort of pretty straightforward in many ways. Like I said, it's basically deciding which antenna is being fed from the transmitter and everything like that. And then looking at a power level. I do see it. Barry says, any other questions or comments? Yeah, we can do them either verbally or by chat. Either way is great. And one of the things that I've learned that's really interesting is when you build a macro that you want to correspond and have basically the same thing on, for instance, each of our 5 stations, you're going to get minor differences. I like to have everything as consistent across the board as possible. My power output is on the same meter on each station, things like that. But Burke will recognize it based on the very specific site. So one of those little tricks I came up with a while ago is I can actually create an additional new and choose a different site for it. Choose on Arc Plus, and this was from BBT, so I could choose to run it on WCVE. And I can literally copy and paste all of those and then just shift them around and then tweak them as I need to. So instead of my aux power level on my WBBT site, I'd have the exact same thing, and I could choose what would become the aux power level on the WCVE site. So you can't directly cut and paste individual entities and make it quick. You got to go through that extra step. But once you do that, you literally can have all of them the same with just minor customizations, which probably is exactly what this is. It overflow of an extra item. It's probably a customization here. Tim Braddock is saying multi-site confirmation, such as one main site, aux, and another, both cannot be on at the same time. Sure. The combinations of things that you can build are pretty much whatever you can think of. The options that they give you, I'm highlighted on this particular diamond right here. The options that they give you are if value, if time, if status, if relay state. So you could literally be having something that's one site, but you can still make stuff that corresponds either to another site, or we also use some things that are mutual monitoring locations. For instance, we're based in Richmond, Virginia. We've got one station that's about an hour and a half, 2 hours south of us, and another one that's about 2 hours to the northeast of us. So they're a little hard to monitor, obviously, by just standard reception, but we've got Innovonics units and various other things that are there. And then we've got some others here in Richmond. So you can mix and match those into any combination that makes sense. And if you include it in a macro, it's a great way to say, hey, I'm running at full power on my main site and I've got a backup location a couple miles away. I certainly don't want to be running at full power on the same one, because obviously that would not be a good combination.
Ken, this code is running at the site, and each site can access data from other sites?
Correct. Yeah. In our particular case, we keep each site separate and we run 5 individual BERT units, but they are all on a wide area network. So they all have a similar IP with one octet being changed for each particular site. And then each one has the macros that run for that particular site. I'm looking at WBBT right now. My macros are on my right side. I've got a few that run for any specific site. So I've got maybe a dozen there. If I click on my WCNV site, you see I've only got 5 there, one of which is tower lights. Apparently it's dreary again today because we had some storms early this morning, and it's saying my tower lights are on right now. So normally, for instance, my tower light macro, and see, I actually have our other engineers there, and it looks like he's literally resetting a fault on that just to see our reaction. But I was starting to say, for instance, the macro that is the tower lights, that is one that runs every night at 9:30 p.m. And we can get alarms otherwise, but I also run that one as a quick and easy check to be able to say, are my lights on and are they functioning as they're supposed to? And that happens to be an ARC Solo. So I can choose that site. And if I open up that particular macro, again, it actually runs nightly at 9:30 p.m. And then I've got a couple of if-thens in there as far as time, because if it happens to run some other time, you don't want to get an email at noon saying, well, the lights are not on because it's noon and you happen to run the macro manually, for instance. But basically I run the macro every night at 9:30, so I don't have to think about whether it's summer or winter or anything like that. And if the status shows that the lights are not on, I email that there's a failure. The message screen is a nice place too, where inside of the web GUI for both the Arc Plus Touch and the Solo, it creates a notation there, and you can see every night ran at 9:30 p.m. and it says tower lights are on. And then additionally, I run a report every week that prints all of those up as a log and says, yes, all of our lights were checked every night, and take the status of when they actually turned on and off. And I've got all of that available as a log to be called back for inspection type purposes. So let's talk about custom views for a little bit. Barry, how are we doing on time?
Doing fine.
Okay. So custom views along the left side here. Again, we use a Google Drive folder, so it doesn't matter whether it's me looking at home or at my desk at the office or at one of the transmitter sites. We steer them all to the same custom views, and I've got some that are relatively simple and start from stuff that the factory created. This was one that I customized for us based on a template provided by Burke. This is a FAX 3K transmitter. Licensed TPO is 2,800 watts. And I added a few extra things to it. So I've got room temperature on it and some other miscellaneous stuff like that. Plus you see I've also got modulation. I'm coming out of a BDR monitor and taking the actual audio feed that's normally designated as going to a speaker, goes into one of my metering channels and presents a pretty decent indication of modulation. Obviously, you wouldn't want to calibrate to anything like that, but you can look at it on a glance and there's your modulation. Can also tell you that if you had an STL failure, that you go through the steps, and in our case, we've got 2 different formats, 2 different brands, 2 different studios. They leave there, they've got the multiple STL paths. So we've got a couple points of failure, and we can trace our way through and be able to say, okay, so I have no modulation here, but everything else is wonderful. Of course, in the case of a Gates Air transmitter, the newer stuff also has a GUI, and you can see it that way, but this creates a nice, simple all-in-one view. One of the things that I've done for each of the sites is what I call a quick. And I'll look at the same site. I've got the quick right there, and it's got a lot more detail to it. And I'm going to get into one that shows even more detail in a few minutes. I've got combination of a couple of things. Some of you see our metering. I've got my main transmitter. I've got my reflected power. I've got a calculation of the VISWR, and I've also got a calculation of my percentage. So all of that in that one little section right there, I can look at that. I can also see what my HVAC is doing, as well as my room temperature. Some of them you'll notice look like buttons. That's because they are. Not sure if you're aware of it or not. I actually will bring this one up into edit mode in a second and show you a couple of things. The buttons we can switch to, for instance, this one right here says HD Link Audio is on the air. I'm going to press it and notice it says use the control key. You can build a safety factor in there so that I would switch to my main or alternate audio by my choice. If I hit it by mistake, I don't want to obviously switch unless I planned that. So another cool thing that I do, you look at that and it's pretty straightforward. There's a lot of stuff there, but it's pretty good quick indication. You look at everything for a site, you can see your power, you can see what transmitters on the air, you can see your basic audio, you can see your air conditioning. But the reality is there's so much more than that. On this screen here, what I actually do is all of that depends on being connected to your site. Well, if I'm not connected, it actually comes up and shows this screen. So you can literally click there and initiate the process on the network to reconnect to that particular site. One of the other cool things that they do is basically visibility. I'm going to slide that part out of my way down like that. And you'll notice now we're seeing both my Flexiva main transmitter and my BE, which is my aux transmitter. But on the other screen, you didn't see that. That's all done in the visibility settings. That's on the very far bottom section here on the lower right. And what I do is I look at the status of when that transmitter says that it's on. That's the only time I show that meter. So if I go out there and I do testing for 20-30 minutes and I turn it on, make sure everything's good, take a bunch of readings, it'll show on this screen for that 20-minute duration. If I switch to it on the air, it'll show on this screen. And if the other one is on, it'll show both. If the other one happens to be off, it takes the appropriate status and it turns that one off as well. Oh, I've got several items in sample in my questions here. Let me scroll through. I've got a couple. I've got a request about showing one about satellite signals over a period of time. I'm getting to that. I also have a note that Burke will be doing some stuff coming up in September as well for anybody who wants to learn more from that direction. This I'm using is the Autopilot software. I've got a question whether this can interface to other stuff such as a Davicom or an Automat. If you're using the SNMP functionality, then it just becomes any network device so that you can connect to. I've got Innovonics units. I've got some little temperature sensors that we bought from Amazon that literally have temperature options for humidity and a couple of other stray things, but they spit it out via SNMP. So that part becomes compatible to any other system, but Autopilot is designed directly to really interface to the Burke stuff. I've also got a question about modulation refresh rate. I'm running about 1.5 seconds. So it's nothing special. It's just the standard speaker feed or line level feed that comes off of a Bell R in most of our cases. And I haven't seen too much of a problem as far as anything other than sometimes you do have to rectify it a little bit just to make it look a little cleaner on the meter. I also have a question about any bottleneck sites with poor internet. Well, in the past we had some internet issues and it loses a bunch of everything because it's got a lot of all or none, but it's never really affected like just my modulation reading on a slow internet speed at all. It still looks pretty much the same. Another question about converting the audio into DC. I normally don't. Sometimes it works without it, and I'm just taking the stuff that comes from the line level output. And sometimes I haven't figured out where the pattern is. Sometimes it works better than others, but like the one that we're looking at here on WBBT, that literally is coming off of a standard Bell R FMS2 and taking the L+R off of the total modulation monitor and sending it directly to the Burke, not converted or anything. And that one looks incredibly clean and precise. Some of the other ones, I do the exact same thing, and it shows some weird spikes and things that could be a good case for a little capacitor or a little bit of rectifying on it. But this one is straight and works perfectly. So we were talking about some of the other things like the visibility. You see, I've got color codes as well as some of the stuff is barely visible along my left side here. My Flexiva is my main transmitter, so I like to know what that temperature is, and that's about where that transmitter seems to like to run. So I've got a high temperature upper limit set 5 degrees above where it is right now, and then I've got my lowers. If you're looking at the far right side, I've got my first lower is about 10 degrees below where it is right now. So it gets about a 15-degree swing. And if I have any kind of major changes in room temperature or anything, I'll see it hit that edge. This will not create alarms. So if you want to do the alarms, you've got to do them somewhere else. So you can color code this so that like if you get up in the morning and one of the things you do is you look at your autopilot and see all your stations, you glance over and you see that you've got a color code of something that's out of the ordinary. Maybe it's not enough to require an email, an alarm, or take you off the air or anything like that, but it might be something where you want to call the HVAC people and say, hey, what's going on? So you can build that just as color conditions onto the screens here. And one of the things that I've done is a lot of the colors become almost invisible. So if I'm looking at the actual screen of that along the left side here, you can see my Flexiva temperature. If you really squint, you can see the others. I keep them just light enough so that I can tell where they were there if I'm editing on them. But they'll become highly visible, like the red right here on my backup. If I have a fault on that transmitter or power supply fault or high temperature, these will do the same thing with colors. And so then that's the basics on everything with that. The HVAC output, I have one of the simple 4-section Burke metering units that they have. Their little boxes are about the size of like a wallet, and they just have probes. I just put one probe in front of each of our HVAC units. This site happens to just be a small site that's like 10 by 20 and wall-mounted barred units. So a couple inches away in front of each of the barred units is where I meter the HVAC. Then I also have my Flexiva temperature. I found that through the SNMP, and that's the front of the unit, which is as air has been sucked in from the back, pulled over the warm electronics and is exhausting out the front. So that's the 105 degrees that we're seeing here. At one point they expanded that MIB and they added a sensor up in the back end where the air intake is. And I might have that backwards. I think it's back to front, but it might be front to back. But This one that says ambient 64 degrees is the other direction. And based on the two air conditioners that are on and knowing which one is positioned where and everything, I think it might actually be air intake is from the front. HVAC unit number 2 is nearer to the front. So lots of cold air is being pumped into the room right now. And by the way, it's 90 degrees outside. So I've got an ambient temperature that corresponds to really close to what the air coming out of the air conditioner is at the front. And then by the time it goes over the electronics, I've got that 40-degree increase coming out the back end. But this station operates on 107.3. And one of the things that I've heard from Gates Air is that temperature number will fluctuate for the ideal for a particular station based on your frequency a little bit. We're up on the far upper end of the dial, so 105 degrees seems to be a good running temperature where we sit all the time, and knock on wood and not jinx it, this unit's been running flawlessly for almost 3 years, I think it is, that we put it in. And the only problems we've had are things like this site doesn't have a generator, so when we've lost power, eventually, obviously, we go off the air. Of course, the Burke, the STL, everything like that is all on a UPS, so that'll at least live for a little while, but the higher power stuff is not on a generator at this site. One of the requests was made as far as we monitor our satellites, and I look at long-term averages. I'm going to start talking about that here, and then I'm going to shift over and go to that screen because that gives a little bit better view. Looking at my modulation, this particular station runs classical music half the time from NPR's Classical 24 service and roughly half the time in-house or other sorted content. So we've actually got some dynamic range. But I've got this graph here that shows a, 30-minute duration of modulation. So if I had anything like an STL feed earlier and it wakes me up with an alarm, but by the time I get organized, get over here, think about everything, and my brain is clear at 3 o'clock in the morning, maybe it's been 2-3 minutes, I'd see that gap right there as a missing point in that 30-minute duration. And then I can try to figure out, well, what's going on and why. I'm also monitoring my line pressure. I found online, just through Amazon, literally little cheap $20 sensors that can convert it to voltage and can monitor your pressure in your transmission line. This little screen here, I'm going to move the main one out of the way. In fact, I think I can close this so we see the actual screen again. So this is the actual in operation. That little section that we saw in the middle becomes a highlighted zone of what is our ideal area. And I've got it marked for that site of about 2.5, 2 3/4 to 4.5 pounds of pressure in my 1 5/8 line. It does these weird little bumps that I've never really figured out, but overall you can see I'm running about somewhere around 3.5, and pressure started to increase here. So my guess would be probably our dehydrator kicked on and brought the pressure up a little bit in this range, and it just held it that steady. Let's look at our satellite stuff that we were talking about. Taking that same concept, this is actually a 24-hour duration on my line pressure. I also do some stuff on my satellites, on my EB signal, on my XDS receivers. We actually have 4 at the studio, and at one point, 2 of our outlying sites each used NPR satellite as an STL, but we've recently converted them to brick links. So I'm still monitoring all 6 ultimately. And I'm doing the same thing with the graph. This graph is a 6-hour duration. My red line is showing my threshold of where they mute. So about 3.9 is where they mute. So I've got this threshold just above that point. So if you're looking at it and you can say, oh, I'm getting bad weather and the snow is getting worse and worse, you know how you can start to get a gauge for how quickly is it going to mute or anything else like that. And of course, they will revert to the internet feed. I've got a comment that says linked pressure sensor on Amazon. Yeah, you just do a search for pressure sensor. They seem to constantly change. They're Chinese units, but we've had ours for about 2 years and they seem to work reliably even with all of that. And literally they were 20 bucks. It's just getting the right fittings on the end. I believe it's a 3/8 OD fitting is what the most common is on it. And $20, and then it's a voltage in and the pressure out. So look for something that's in the like 0 to 15 psi and 0 to 15 volts DC kind of deal. I also have a comment about a Fax 40 at the upper end of the band as well. And Walter from Gates Air did confirm the higher frequency does run with a higher temperature. We've got a link now in the chat, says pressure transducer sender. Well, it's not a link, but it's the description. Oil, fuel, air, water, 1/8 inch NPT stainless steel, 100 PSI. The ones that I got were 15 PSI because we obviously don't normally go much higher than that. You can find 250 PSI, you can find 100 PSI, you can find 50 PSI. I did contract work for a while for a station here in Richmond that was not EMF, one of the other religious broadcasters. And they used an approach of, instead of a dehydrator, they actually had a large tool compressor and 2 regulators to drop it down to about 3 PSI. But if you wanted to be able to meter something on the other side of the first regulator, they were up to 150 pounds of like impact wrench pressure, and you'd be able to measure with something like that. Barry found one right here. And so there is a link in the chat. Barry found one. Then it's on Amazon. The ones we found, like I said, 20 bucks, and they've worked for a couple of years with no problem. And David Land says, thanks, Barry. So let's talk about the satellite receivers. So obviously we know that XDS receivers, mutes, have optimum settings, etc. So looking at our 4 in the studio, we've got a splitter that's split for the 4 of them, and we went through some combinations to be able to re-engineer it based on getting not too much signal or not too much lack of signal. And we normally run it looks like today 10.2, 10.3 on our EB on them. A trick that I learned several years ago is the AGC value. Many people don't know this. Everybody always says, well, tune for the highest EB you can get, and whatever you get really high, that's wonderful. You can actually overload the front end of an XDS receiver. About 50 is where you're just touching a little bit of the AGC drive on it. If you're down around 20, you're like at just barely enough signal. And if you've got a 9.5, 10.0, you basically have no safety factor at all in there. If you're around 50, you're hitting a little bit onto the AGC, and that's actually a really good sweet spot. If you start getting your AGC upwards of 75 or so, you can actually be overloading it and still seeing signal strength. So that's a side note. Oh, Barry linked another one. I was going to say the price went up because every price has, but no, he says it's 30 PSI, 1665. There's an additional link now for Amazon. But anyway, back to our satellite receivers. So this drop right here, if I were to take a guess, that's probably where we had some weather earlier today. Because you can see all 4 of them dropped, and these 2 are geographically at 2 other locations. So all 6 of our receivers dropped a little bit at about noon today. But I'm looking at, this is 8:48 a.m. to 2:46 p.m. So that's a 6-hour spread there. And the way you do that is when you're in the editing screen, it designates how many seconds that you want to show on a chart. So you just have to do the math on how many seconds is whatever duration of time. I've got one that runs for 3 days. So I can actually literally look back and see all my nuances of 3 days. So here's a big hole right there. That's probably where we had a severe rainstorm about 7 o'clock this morning. I can't remember if we had some bad weather yesterday, but you can see the ups and downs over my 3-day window here, and none of them being horrible. The dotted line here is just an additional line that you can put in editing mode, and it's more of my long-term average. So I'm running a little lower than my long-term average right now, but never into a dangerous zone on any of them. And you can see, for instance, this one in Chase City, I'm overall average is right about on my average. I've got some definite holes down. I've got some peaks going up a little higher and everything like that. But again, nothing in any kind of a real danger zone on any of these units. And so this gives us a real good indication, especially if we're having bad weather. Well, what's going on with my XDS receivers? Those all being done through SNMP. Something that I learned as well is, depending on who your network is, if it's Westwood, well, they've just changed receivers, or if it's some of the others, they're still using XDS, they might be on SNMP version 2. We actually have this long list of assorted things that I'm looking at on SNMP, and NPR had them custom do all of the stuff to SNMP version 3, and they also send the default password out on a regular basis. So I tried to change passwords and put it to our standard and keep it inside of our WAN and everything, and then I was getting issues because NPR changes it back every 30 minutes via the uplink. So I had to keep some of those on standard combinations. But all of this information is being received via SNMP from my different satellite receivers. Oh, I have a couple of chats, and if he wants to unmute, if he's got a microphone, Mike is my coworker and supervisor, and
we are partners.
We are partners.
Yeah, hey, this is a great example. We've used it. The satellite providers sometimes are like, hey, what gives? We're having some problems. And many times they'll ask what the environment is like on our end, but we can take a look at this one page and go, no, it's actually happening in 3 different markets, 100 miles apart. And we did that once before.
Yes, we did.
Yep.
Yeah, the 4 on the left side are all at our location in Richmond, Virginia. The 2 on the right, Chase City, if you look it up on a map, is about an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes drive southwards. So what is that, 7,500 miles? And then Heathsville is the opposite direction. So geographically, it's a little bit of a spread across the state of Virginia. Barry, how are we doing on time?
We're doing fine. We're coming up on 10 till the hour. And
okay.
How are you going to be able to show us perhaps interfacing with a different piece of gear?
I don't have anything configured for a different piece of gear, but what I can do is I can click on, like I said, if it's the basic functions, like we see on these screens, that specifically is designed to go to a Burke. So if it's anything else, I'll click on, for instance, one of my Innovonics monitors. If it's coming via SNMP, as long as you know what the MIB is, SNMP is all about the MIB and the OID. If you know what the OID is, you can actually enter the information in, and you really don't even need to store the MIB into the autopilot folder on Windows. I'll look at this device. We've got about a dozen entries that I'm reading here, and I indicate I've got some numbering just to make them convenient, and then descriptions on a couple as to what they are. But let's go ahead and edit this particular device. It's all inside my private network, so there's no way you'd be able to get to anything anyway, which means I can also, a thing that I learned a long time ago is you get sick, you leave your job, somebody else comes in, you share the job with another person, whatever. Certain things need to have very specific passwords that nobody else knows. But sometimes you want the passwords that are the defaults. And if you keep your system on the right side of secure so that the wrong people can't even get to the device, then there really isn't a problem with keeping things like default passwords like public, which is the default password and everything for SNMP. But it's inside of our network. I'm on the VPN, etc. So theoretically, nobody else can get through all of our routers and firewalls to be able to get to that point. You can add the MIB in there and then be able to search for it. In this case, it's an Innovonics 531 that we're looking at. You don't actually have to if you know what the OID is. For anybody who does not know a lot about SNMP, it was mentioned in the chat a little while ago that Burke is going to be doing something again in September. I would assume they're going to be talking about it. And there's been a couple of other people that have really gotten into the depth of creating SNMP, if you will. But once you're at the point of understanding that part of it, then it's implementing it. And so what I'm looking at here is I can get DMOD left, DMOD right. This particular modulation monitor happens to be a site where we run a 67 kilohertz subcarrier for a reading service for the blind. So I monitor the subcarrier. I also monitor my pilot. Normally it stays on the one frequency of 88.9, but we can switch to something else, and including it, just like everything else, has a web GUI nowadays. I can see overall modulation. I can see subcarrier mode. I can get indications for alarm loss and all the various things for RDS information, PI, PS, etc., like that. So as I go through, Barry's asking, well, how would you implement this with some other device? Again, if it has SNMP and you have the MIB, you can get to that point, get to this screen, and you scroll through, and then you designate, well, which ones do I want? What do I want to do with them? Part of the what do I want to do with them is what is the particular one that I'm looking at. Let's, for instance, look at pilot. It's a meter. It could be also a status or a text, but pilot is a meter. So I can create a label that says pilot level. I designate that as percent. And I set my meter for 0 to 15 because it actually happens to look good. You can use any value. Of course, pilot would normally be a 9% injection. And then this particular item pulls every 5 seconds out to the modulation monitor and says, what is that SNMP value? With it being a meter, you can also designate limits. You don't have to, though. In this case, I've got color codes that are designated for low or high as well as normal, but I don't have any limits because I can also utilize those elsewhere if I want to. So then that brings me through that device, and then here I'm looking at my pilot, and I actually, because of the fact that we also have that 67, I run that pilot just a touch low. I don't run it right at 9. I intentionally run it just a hair low, and it's also NPR news content, so I figure if it gets in any fringes and anybody has a hard time decoding it, they're going to get a mono signal as opposed to stereo. With news coverage is possibly not a bad thing anyway. But that would be how you would utilize with some other manufacturer's device. So as you can see, I'm looking at not just Burke equipment. On my SNMP, I've got several Gates Air devices. I've got several XDS receivers, several Innovonics devices. These little guys, this is what I said is our temperature sensor. They're by NTI Corporation, and it's just an internal sensor mounted on the side of the rack, so you can see the rack temperature as opposed to some other probe. And for instance, this one is at one of our transmitter sites, and the room right now is running 74 degrees Fahrenheit. It's really about the only reading that I get from that device. And when I look through the MIB, the device has capability for other options that we don't utilize. So that's pretty much the long and short of it. I've also got a comment now, another neat fact regarding SNMP. If you secure the network between broadcast multiple sites, anyone can communicate with anything else on the network. Yes. Similar to, like I said, we store everything in the Google Drive, and we make a lot of our configurations the exact same. All of that stuff is accessed through every device on the network, so it doesn't matter where we are, we can get all of this information. Or if I want to, I can customize, I can save those files and then transpose them over to another station, or I can customize and say, hey, you know what? If I'm not at the WCNV transmitter, maybe I don't want to bother with that one, and I could delete that particular one off on this particular location. So you can do all of that through the capabilities of the SNMP.
Joe, you're probably going to answer that yes, but I'll ask it anyway. You were showing the Innovonics and showing the metering. Do you have actual graphic display or just text?
You are correct. I am going to answer yes. The one here that says audio custom view. What is that? 12 meters here. I've got connected to the modulation that shows from the transmitter sites. I've got stuff coming from a Bell HD2 monitor. I've got stuff coming from several other indications. I've got my subcarrier. So yeah, all of the above, including one of them is a Diva monitor that I bought several years ago when I previously actually worked for what became our same stations. It's not a bad little monitor, 1 RU, and it's the 4000 model modulation monitor. So it spits out, and in Europe, instead of calling it 100% modulation, they refer to the kilohertz deviation. So you have to do the math on that, but I've got in my lower left here, one of the ones is coming off that Diva monitor, and I let it scan through the market. So right now, it just changed, in fact, to 102.1, which is one of our EAS stations that one of the commercial stations own. And I can see the modulation on it. That's doing a sample on about every 3 seconds. So it's nowhere near precise for audio, but it gives a little bit of an indication. And it also allows me to see the RDS information coming not just from us, but from the competitors. And among other things, it'll tell me if I've got a bad antenna on the roof or any other variation. So I just let that one scan between various things in the market. But the one that we were looking at a minute ago when Barry asked the question is this one right here, marked the Innovonics 531. And since we care about it, I'm looking at SCA number 1 is the RDS, and I'm running an injection on my RDS of 5.3%. I've got decent looking modulation levels, and it looks like its refreshes on the order of about every 2 to 3 seconds. Then I'm also pulling the RT, which we change, and we do some very detailed stuff with Arctic Palm software because of NPR programming. And I monitor all that so I can see exactly what's going on with all of the above. And usually we end up that, out of my own preference, I usually leave this one in the office as this screen that sits for audio. And you can see I've also got a 30-minute average, and I can look at all of them and I can say, oh, these two, which are simulcast, that must have been a long, low passage of classical music through there because they're both sort of low. But doesn't look like there's any kind of problem other than, yeah, we do have an STL that we're actually in the middle of working on. So I do have an STL SNR that is through the floor because right now it doesn't have a transmitter sending a signal to it, and we're on a Comrex on that until we get a tower crew in.
Alan Sherrill asks, have you integrated a camera with this system?
I have not. I did a variation that is something I will mention here. I've got one that is called Virginia Map. You can also do a camera, and it does a similar approach where it takes basically an HTTP file view of the camera, and you can do something with it. This one happens to be getting an HTTP view of website, which is Weather Underground's live radar right now for the Richmond area. So I can see what is going on weather-wise. And even though I don't actually have a camera, it can be done if you've got the right cameras. Many of them are literally just IP address slash, I think it's like might be view.html or something like that to actually view it in a browser. But on this map, I've also got literally the geographic combinations for each of our stations. So WMVE is getting close to the North Carolina border. WBBT is technically licensed to Powhatan, which I guess could best be described as sort of a suburb of Richmond. Here's downtown Richmond right here. WCVE is adjacent. Then I've got WWLB. So both of those were basically rim shot signals. And WCNV in what people in Virginia refer to as the Northern Neck. So that becomes a quick glance where I can see all of our critical properties that way. Just real quick and simple. Each one is green, so there's no alarms. All of my percentages are where they should be for power output, so I know there's no transmitter issues in that regard. And I can also see storm activity going on the radar.
No question, this has really jumped the boundaries of what remote control was 30 years ago, even 20 years ago.
Yes. Yes, I was telling before we started, the first station I ever worked at had a Rust remote control, and among other things, you needed to make sure, let's see, channel 6 was tower 1 phase, channel 7 is tower 1 ratio, whatever it was. Make sure you're on the correct one, because when you slide that switch to the one side to actually get the needle to move and take a reading, if you're in the wrong point, oops, you just turned it off the air.
Yep, seen that. Was that with the phone dial?
That was with the phone dial on the front, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Make sure it steps properly.
Yep. And by that point in time, this was 1940 something. It didn't always, if it ever did. I think we're largely ready to wrap up. I actually want to bring one other screen up, because this one's, again, shows all of anything you can want to look at. So we've got 5 FMs, and each column is a different FM. And it's pretty self-explanatory when you look through all the different combinations there. 3 of them have backup transmitters, 2 of them do not. 3 of them have generators, a different combination do not. Then they've all got various combinations of what HVAC is required in the room. Some of them are American Tower properties, some we own. It's like any other broadcaster with a multiple ownership combination. We've got a little bit of mix and match of everything, but this gives a nice quick glance. And I usually leave this on at home. I can see exactly what's going on a moment's notice on all of the details that you can think of. Do I have any faults? Is my STL where it should be? Do I have a temperature condition? Is my power where it should be? All of the above. I think let's wrap up at that point.
Very nice, Joe. And I appreciate the time that you took to put all this together, and especially to show us not only a live view of what's going on, but how you program it. I think that's really instructive.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the interesting things that I've learned is Burke really goes above and beyond with trying to help with anybody. And if you've got an off-air emergency, they'll call you back quickly. And if you email them, they'll get back to you promptly if it's not off-air or whatever. They do a great job with it. And sometimes you just learn of, well, what happens if I do this? And it's like, oh, that doesn't look good. And you change it.
Very nice, very nice. Anyone else have any questions for Joe before we close him down?
I had a couple of quick questions.
Go ahead.
First off, there's the graphic method of generating the macros and so on. I wonder what the underlying code looks like. What's it generating?
Well, I actually saw that one time, and it is ultimately text that it's doing. I don't think, if I remember correctly, it stores it as XML. A lot of the stuff is stored as XML. I think that's stored as something else, but they actually recently made an upgrade you'll notice these all have padlocks on them. They have an option now for encrypted data sending, and I went to upgrade one of our software versions, and it made a few changes that I needed to basically back out of. But in the process of doing that, I essentially saw, wow, so a lot of those are literally still just standard programming text statements. It's just so much easier. If you've got a simple, well, at 5:30 a.m., send an email saying, does my email system work? And you can look in your email when you wake up at 6 o'clock and say, yeah, I got 5 emails. I expected 5. My email's working. That's one line. But if you've got something as complicated as some of the stuff that I had, that's a lot more than one line. Trying to get that right as text as opposed to the GUI. The GUI helps quite a lot. They've really done a lot with developing the GUI and making it very intuitive. So as you work your way through, it just builds up as more and more and more text items, but you never actually see the text items.
This is really, really nice. Things have advanced. I wonder if you were there long ago with the DRC 190 system that went in like the late 80s or so?
What do you mean there?
With West Virginia Public Radio put in a large DRC 190 system. Francis Fisher did that way back when. There's all basic program stuff that I designed.
Oh, okay. No, I'm actually in Virginia, not West Virginia.
Okay, sorry. Wrong state.
Not a problem. But I've actually been, I'm originally from Rochester, New York, but I came down here in 2013. I actually I worked for one group down here that was sort of the tertiary commercial player in the area. I left them, and then I came back right after what was at the time Commonwealth Public Broadcasting bought my old stations, and then they changed their name to Virginia Public Media, and I've been here now for 3 years. But in the 3 years that I've been here, we managed to fully redo the racks at several of the transmitter sites, replace, add a backup that didn't have one at one of the sites, get rid of an old backup at another site, get a brand new main, and put the previous main to a backup position. We've ended up consolidating studios and doing a whole bunch more stuff because that's the broadcast way nowadays.
Very good. This is very nice. Thank you. And sorry about the wrong state.
Yeah, no, not a problem. Not a problem. Yeah, I think I want to leave it with, if you look, like for instance on here I mentioned autopilot is not really a good place for doing alarms. You can actually have an autopilot run at a transmitter site, and you can have it do stuff and even do emailing and everything like that out. I find it better to do it directly on the device. And I think part of that is preference, but I do the alarms on my device, but then you look here, for instance, you can see that I've got various things that are in different shades of color. They give you a whole palette of color that you can choose from. So not just very simple red, green, yellow, blue, and purple, not just like 4 or 5 colors like that, but they literally give you the whole palette. And then you can also copy stuff. So for instance, it is very precise that where I've got my tower lights okay on this one and showing on, and then tower lights okay and showing off on this one, those are at the exact same horizontal level so that they cosmetically really do fall into line. And you can do all of that with just a couple of clicks. But when it's all said and done, you end up with this customization that is so much more advanced than the basic screen of, okay, here's some information. But literally I can know in a heartbeat what's going on at all of my sites, if I can find it, by looking at just that one screen again. And on that note.
All right. Joe, thank you. And now